The kitchen was small, smaller than I remembered kitchens being when I was young. Its walls were a faded yellow, like the pages of an old book left too long in the sun. The linoleum floor curled at the edges, and the air carried the faint scent of dish soap and yesterday's stew. I sat at the table, a wobbly thing with one leg shorter than the others, and stared at the plate in front of me. A slice of bread, a smear of butter, and a bowl of lukewarm soup. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me of my place in this house, a place that wasn't mine anymore. I wasn't always alone in the kitchen. Once, this house was filled with laughter, the kind that spills over like water from a too-full glass. My son, Daniel, used to sit at this very table, his small hands clutching crayons, drawing pictures of dogs and trees while I stirred pots on the stove. Back then, the kitchen was the heart of our home, where stories were told, and dreams were shared over plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes. But that was before Sarah, his wife, decided I was a burden, before I was relegated to eating alone, like a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. It started subtly, the way these things often do. A glance here, a sigh there. Sarah's lips would tighten when I spoke too long at dinner, or when I reached for a second helping. "We're trying to keep things tidy," she'd say, her voice sharp as a knife's edge, when I left a crumb on the counter. Daniel, bless his heart, never noticed. He was too busy with his job, his new life, his new wife. I didn't blame him. Not really. He was still my boy, even if he'd forgotten how to look at me the way he used to. But tonight was different. Tonight, Sarah had crossed a line. "Eleanor," she'd said, her tone clipped as she stood in the doorway of the dining room. "We're having guests tonight. It's better if you eat in the kitchen." Her eyes didn't meet mine, but her words landed like a slap. I'd nodded, because what else could I do? I was a guest in their home, a tenant in the life I'd helped build. So, I took my plate and retreated, the sound of their laughter trailing after me like a song I wasn't invited to sing. As I sat there, spoon hovering over the soup, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something quieter, deeper, a kind of resolve I hadn't felt in years. I was 78. Not dead. I'd raised a son, buried a husband, and weathered storms that would have broken softer souls. I wasn't about to let Sarah, with her manicured nails and her cold smiles, reduce me to a shadow. The phone sat on the counter, an old landline Daniel had kept for emergencies. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I'd overheard them talking last week, Sarah's voice high and anxious about the mortgage payments. "If we miss another one, we're in trouble," she'd said. Daniel had murmured something about working overtime, but I knew the truth. They were stretched thin, living a life they couldn't afford. And I knew something else, something Sarah didn't think I'd noticed. The mortgage company's number was scrawled on a notepad by the fridge, circled in red ink. I dialed the number, my heart pounding in my chest. The line crackled, and a woman's voice answered, calm and professional. "First National Mortgage. How can I assist you?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "Yes," I said, my voice clear despite the tremor in my hands. "I'd like to make a payment on an account." The woman asked for the account number, and I read it off the notepad, my eyes flicking to the kitchen door. I could still hear the clink of glasses and the hum of conversation from the dining room. "And whose name is this under?" she asked. I hesitated, just for a moment. "Daniel and Sarah Thompson," I said, "but I'm calling on their behalf. I'm family." The lie felt heavy on my tongue, but I pushed forward. I gave her my credit card number, the one I kept for emergencies, the one with just enough left to cover a single payment. It wasn't much, but it was something, a lifeline. A reminder that I wasn't invisible. The payment will be processed by morning, the woman said, and I thanked her, hanging up before the weight of what I'd done could settle. I sat back in the chair, the soup untouched. For the first time in months, I felt alive, like I'd reclaimed a piece of myself. Sarah could push me to the edges of this house, but she couldn't erase me. Not yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Sarah's voice, sharp and frantic. Daniel, did you make a payment last night? The bank just called. They said it's cleared. I stayed in my room. The door cracked just enough to hear. Daniel sounded confused. No, I didn't. Maybe it was a mistake. Sarah's footsteps paced the floor. It wasn't a mistake. Someone paid it. We need to find out who. I smiled to myself. A small, secret thing. Let them wonder. Let them question. I wasn't just the old woman in the kitchen anymore. I was Eleanor, and I still had a voice. The days that followed were a quiet kind of chaos. Sarah was relentless, calling the bank, checking statements. Her voice a constant hum of suspicion. Someone accessed our account, she'd say, her words slicing through the air at breakfast. Daniel, ever the peacemaker, tried to calm her. Maybe it was a glitch. Sarah, let's not make a big deal out of it. But I could see the worry in his eyes. The same worry I'd seen when he was a boy, afraid of failing a test or disappointing me. It hurt to watch, but I kept my silence. My secret tucked away like a letter in a locked drawer. I spent more time in the kitchen now, not because I was told to, but because it felt safer. The dining room was Sarah's domain, with its polished table and her carefully chosen centerpiece, a glass bowl filled with fake lemons. The kitchen, though, was mine in a way, even if it was just a borrowed space. I'd sit there in the mornings, sipping weak coffee, listening to the house wake up. The creak of the stairs as Daniel left for work. The sharp click of Sarah's heels as she prepared for her day. They moved around me like I was furniture, something to step over or around. But I wasn't invisible. Not anymore. That single phone call had lit something inside me, a spark I thought had long since burned out. I started paying attention, really paying attention, to the cracks in their perfect life. The late-night arguments about money, muffled but not quiet enough. The way Sarah's smile faltered when Daniel mentioned his long hours at the office. The stack of unopened bills tucked behind the toaster. Out of sight, but not out of mind. I saw it all, and I began to understand something. Sarah's control wasn't as solid as she thought. One afternoon, while Sarah was out, I found myself alone in the house. Daniel was at work, and the silence was heavy, like a blanket too thick for summer. I wandered into the living room, a place I rarely went anymore. It was pristine, all sharp angles and modern furniture. But it felt cold, like a showroom instead of a home. On the coffee table, half hidden under a magazine, was a letter from the mortgage company. My heart skipped as I picked it up, my fingers brushing the crisp paper. It was a confirmation of the payment I'd made, addressed to Daniel and Sarah. I tucked it back where I'd found it, but not before memorizing the account number again, just in case. That evening, Sarah was quieter than usual. She didn't send me to the kitchen, didn't even look at me as she set the table for dinner. Daniel noticed, too. Everything okay? He asked, his voice soft, concerned. Sarah nodded, but her jaw was tight, her eyes distant. I ate with them that night, a rare occurrence, and the silence was louder than any argument. I wondered if she suspected something, if she'd seen the letter, but I didn't ask. I just ate my chicken and peas, savoring the small victory of being at the table. Later, in my room, I pulled out my old journal, the one I'd kept since my husband passed. Its pages were filled with memories, Daniel's first steps, our family vacations, the way John used to hum while he fixed the car. But now, I wrote something new. I wrote about the kitchen, about Sarah's words, about the phone call. It felt good to put it down, to make it real. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was choosing. The next morning, I overheard Sarah on the phone again. "Yes, I need to know who made that payment," she said, her voice low but urgent. "It's our account. I have a right to know." I stood in the hallway, my breath shallow, waiting. The bank wouldn't tell her. I knew that. I'd been careful, using my own card, my own name. But her persistence worried me. Sarah wasn't the type to let things go. By the end of the week, she'd hired Sumania, a private investigator. She called him, though he sounded more like a friend of a friend who knew computers. Daniel didn't like it. "This is ridiculous, Sarah," he said one night, his voice rising. "You're turning this into a conspiracy." She didn't back down. "Someone's messing with our lives. Daniel, don't you care?" I stayed in my room, my heart racing. I hadn't expected this. Hadn't thought she'd go so far. But I wasn't afraid. Not yet. I started planning. If Sarah was going to dig, I'd have to be smarter. I thought about the mortgage company again. About the power of that one call. I could do it again. Maybe. But I'd need to be careful. I'd need a reason. Something bigger than spite. Because this wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about Daniel. About the boy I'd raised. About the family we used to be. I wanted to remind myself that I still mattered. The house felt different now. Like a stage where everyone knew their lines, but not the ending. Sarah's investigation had turned the air tense. And I could feel her eyes on me, searching for clues I wasn't sure I'd left. I kept to my routine coffee in the kitchen. Quiet evenings in my room, but I was always listening. Always watching. The notepad by the fridge was gone now, replaced by a locked drawer in Sarah's desk. She thought she was clever, but I'd already memorized what I needed. One morning, Daniel came to me. It was early, the sky still gray, and he knocked softly on my door. "Mom," he said, stepping inside, his face a mix of exhaustion and something softer. Something like guilt. "Can we talk?" I nodded, gesturing to the chair by my small desk. He sat, his hands clasped, looking too big for the room that had once been his nursery. "I know things haven't been easy," he started, his voice low. "Sarah's been stressed. The house. The bill sits a lot." He paused, searching my face. "I just want you to know we're grateful you're here. I don't say it enough." His words were a balm, but they didn't erase the sting of the kitchen table, the solitude of my meals. I smiled, though, because he was trying, and that was something. "Daniel," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I know you're doing your best, but I'm not just here to take up space. I want to help." His brow furrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might ask about the payment, might connect the dots. But he didn't. He just nodded, squeezing my hand before leaving for work. It was enough to keep me going, enough to remind me why I'd made that call. Sarah, though, was a different story. Her suspicion had grown into something sharper, something that followed me like a shadow. One evening, as I washed dishes in the kitchen, she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Eleanor," she said, her voice cold. "Have you been using the phone?" My hands stilled in the soapy water, but I didn't turn around, only to call my friend Margaret. I said, keeping my tone light. It wasn't a lie, Margaret and I talked every week, but Sarah's silence told me she wasn't convinced. She didn't push. Not then. But I knew she was watching. I started being more careful, using the phone only when she was out, keeping my journal hidden under a loose floorboard in my room. I wrote more now. Not just about the present, but about the past, about the sacrifices I'd made for Daniel. The nights I'd stayed up worrying when he was sick. The years I'd spent building a life for us. Writing it down made me feel stronger, like I was stitching together the pieces of who I used to be. One afternoon, while Sarah was at a yoga class, I found the courage to call the mortgage company again. This time, I didn't just make a payment. I asked questions. What happens if payments are missed? I said, my voice steady. The woman on the line was patient, explaining late fees, credit risks, foreclosure. I listened, my mind racing. I wasn't planning to hurt them, not really, but knowledge was power, and I needed every bit I could get. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of guilt and triumph. I didn't want to destroy their life, but I wanted them to see me, to understand that I wasn't just an old woman to be pushed aside. I thought about telling Daniel, about sitting him down and explaining everything, the kitchen, the call, the way Sarah's words had cut me. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. That night, Sarah invited me to eat with them again. It felt like a test, her eyes sharp as she passed me the potatoes. Daniel smiled, oblivious, talking about a project at work. I ate slowly, savoring the moment, but I could feel the weight of Sarah's gaze. Eleanor, she said suddenly, you've been awfully quiet lately. Everything okay? Her tone was sweet, but there was an edge to it, a challenge. I met her eyes, my own steady, just thinking about the past. I said, and the future? She didn't respond, but I saw the flicker of unease in her face. It was enough for now. I went to bed that night with a plan forming, not fully clear, but growing sharper with every passing day. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The tension in the house grew thicker, like fog rolling in before a storm. Sarah's questions became more pointed, her glances more accusing. She'd stopped hiding the bills, but she'd also stopped talking about them in front of me. I knew she was piecing things together, or trying to. I caught her once, rifling through my room while she thought I was napping. She didn't find the journal. I'd moved it to a new hiding spot under the mattress, but her boldness unnerved me. I wasn't just fighting for my place now. I was fighting to keep my secrets. Daniel, though, was starting to notice the cracks. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching an old movie, he turned to me, his voice low. Mom, is something going on? Sarah's been different. I wanted to tell him everything, to spill the truth about the kitchen, the phone calls, the way his wife had made me feel like a stranger in my own family. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I said, she's under a lot of pressure. Daniel, you both are. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The same doubt I'd planted with that first payment. I started spending more time outside the house, taking long walks through the neighborhood. It gave me space to think, to plan. The streets were lined with old oaks, their branches heavy with autumn leaves, and I'd walk until my legs ached, remembering the days when Daniel and I would rake those leaves into piles, laughing as we jumped in them. Those memories fueled me, reminded me why I was doing this, not out of spite, but out of love. Love for the boy I'd raised. Love for the life we'd built. One afternoon, I stopped at a small cafe, a place I hadn't visited in years. The barista, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled as she handed me my tea. You look like you've got a story to tell, she said, half joking. I smiled back, but her words stuck with me. I did have a story, and it wasn't over yet. Sitting there, sipping chamomile, I made a decision. I'd call the mortgage company again. But this time, I'd do more than make a payment. I'd offer to cover the next one, too. But only if they send a letter to the house, addressed to me. A bold move. But I needed Sarah to know I wasn't invisible. The call was quick. The woman on the line efficient. We can send a confirmation letter, she said. To whom should it be addressed? I gave her my name, Eleanor Marie Thompson, and the address. My heart raced as I hung up, knowing the letter would arrive in a few days. It was a risk, but a calculated one. I wanted Sarah to see it, to wonder, to confront me. I was tired of hiding. When the letter arrived, it was tucked among the usual bills, but Sarah spotted it immediately. I was in the kitchen, peeling apples, when she stormed in, holding the envelope like it was evidence in a trial. "Eleanor," she said, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "What is this?" I looked up, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest. "Open it," I said calmly. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the page. I watched her face change confusion, then realization, then something like fear. "You paid our mortgage," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why?" I set the knife down, meeting her gaze. "Because I'm part of this family, Sarah, whether you like it or not." She stood there, speechless, the letter trembling in her hands. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who'd pushed me away, but as someone afraid of losing control, of losing the life she'd built. Daniel came home an hour later, and Sarah showed him the letter. I stayed in the kitchen, listening as their voices rose and fell. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" Daniel asked, standing in the doorway, his face a mix of gratitude and confusion. I took a deep breath, ready to explain, ready to fight for my place. "Because I needed you to see me," I said, "not just as your mother, but as someone who still has something to give." The kitchen was quiet that night, but it wasn't the silence of solitude anymore. It was the silence of something shifting, something breaking open. Daniel sat across from me at the wobbly table, his hands folded, his eyes searching mine. Sarah stood in the doorway, the letter still clutched in her hand, her face a storm of emotions I couldn't quite read. For the first time in months, I wasn't eating alone, but the victory felt fragile, like a cracked glass waiting to shatter. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice soft but heavy. "Why didn't you tell me things were this bad?" I looked at him. My boy, now a man with worry lines etched into his face. I wanted to reach out, to smooth those lines away like I did when he was small. But I stayed still. I tried. I said, "But you were busy." "And Sarah," I glanced at her, her lips pressed tight. Sarah made it clear where I stood. She flinched, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Daniel turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What's she talking about, Sarah?" His voice wasn't accusing. Not yet. But there was an edge to it, a crack in the trust they'd built. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting to the letter. "I didn't mean," she started, but the words faltered. She didn't mean what? To make me feel like a burden, to banish me to the kitchen. I waited, but she didn't finish. Instead, she turned and left the room, her footsteps sharp against the floor. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "I didn't know, Mom. I swear I didn't know." I believed him. Daniel had always been a good son, even if he'd been distracted by the life he was trying to build. I reached across the table, touching his hand. "I know," I said, "but things need to change." The next few days were uneasy. Sarah avoided me, her usual sharpness replaced by a quiet that felt almost worse. She didn't send me to the kitchen, but she didn't invite me to the table either. Daniel tried to bridge the gap, insisting we eat together, but the meals were tense, the air thick with unspoken words. I kept writing in my journal, pouring out my thoughts, my fears, my hopes. It was my anchor, a way to hold on to myself when the house felt like it was slipping away. One evening, I found Sarah in the living room, alone, staring at the letter from the mortgage company. She didn't hear me come in, and for a moment, I saw her not as my adversary, but as a woman carrying her own burdens. Sarah, I said softly, and she startled, turning to face me. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. Why did you do it? She asked again, her voice raw. The money. Why? I sat down across from her, folding my hands in my lap. Because I love Daniel, I said, and because I wanted to remind you both that I'm still here. I'm not just an old woman taking up space. I've lived a life. Sarah, I've lost things, too. But I'm not done yet. She looked away, her jaw tight. But she didn't argue. For the first time, I felt like she was listening. The next morning, she surprised me. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when she walked in and set a plate of toast on the table. Sit with us tonight, she said, not meeting my eyes. It wasn't an apology. Not quite. But it was a start. I nodded, my throat tight. That night, we ate together. And though the conversation was stilted, it was real. Daniel talked about work. Sarah mentioned a book she was reading. And I shared a story about Daniel as a boy, how he'd once tried to fix the toaster with a butter knife. He laughed. And for a moment, the room felt like home again. But I wasn't naive. One dinner didn't fix everything. Sarah's walls were still up. And I knew trust would take time. I kept the mortgage company's number in my mind. Not because I planned to call again, but because it reminded me of my own strength. I'd spent too long letting Sarah define my place in this house. Now, I was ready to claim it myself. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of the tension that had gripped the house. Sarah didn't apologize. Not in words. But her actions spoke louder than her silence. She stopped hovering when I used the kitchen. Stopped watching me like I was a thief in her home. Dinners became a regular thing. Not just a gesture. Daniel seemed lighter. His smiles more genuine. And I began to feel like I belonged again, not just as a mother, but as Eleanor. A woman with stories and strength and a place at the table. One afternoon, I found an old photo album in the attic, tucked away in a box of things I'd thought lost. It was filled with pictures of Daniel as a boy, his gap-toothed grin, his muddy sneakers, the birthday cakes I'd baked with too much frosting. I brought it downstairs, setting it on the coffee table. When Sarah saw it, she hesitated, then sat beside me. Is that Daniel? She asked, pointing to a photo of him in a cowboy hat, brandishing a toy gun. I nodded, and for the first time, we laughed together, sharing stories of a boy she hadn't known but was starting to understand. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when Sarah's old sharpness surfaced, when I felt the sting of her earlier rejection. But I was learning to meet her halfway, to see her not just as the woman who'd sent me to the kitchen, but as someone struggling to hold her world together. I didn't need her to like me, but I needed her to respect me, and I think she was starting to. One evening, as we cleared the table after dinner, Daniel pulled me aside. Mom, he said, his voice low. I found the journal. My heart stopped. I thought it was safe, hidden under the floorboard. I didn't read much, he said quickly, seeing my face. Just enough to know how much you've been hurting. I'm sorry. I should have seen it. His eyes were wet, and I realized he was crying not the loud sobs of a child, but the quiet tears of a man who'd failed someone he loved. I hugged him, something I hadn't done in too long. It's okay, I said, though it wasn't. Not entirely. We're here now? He nodded, and we stood there, the weight of the past settling around us like dust. Sarah watched from the doorway, and I saw something new in her eyes: regret. Maybe. Or understanding. I didn't call the mortgage company again. I didn't need to. The letter had done its job, not just in shaking Sarah's control, but in reminding me of my own power. I started speaking up more, sharing stories at dinner, offering to help with small things around the house. Sarah didn't always welcome it, but she didn't push me away either. It was progress, slow but real. One night, as I sat in my room, I opened my journal to a new page. I wrote about the kitchen, not as a place of exile, but as a place where I'd found my voice again. I wrote about Daniel, about Sarah, about the family we were rebuilding, piece by piece. I wrote about love, not the easy kind, but the kind that fights through pain and misunderstanding to find something stronger. As I closed the journal, I looked out the window at the stars, bright against the autumn sky. I was 78, but I wasn't done. Not with this house, not with this family, not with myself. I'd been pushed to the edges, but I'd found my way back, not with anger, but with courage. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.